Hi, I'm David Sandlin, MD PhD student and hobbyist baker. Thanks for watching this video on how to bake a delicious bread. By the end of this video, I will have shown you basic forms of yeast available to bakers and how to best promote their reactivation, the difference between two primary flours used in bread making, a few different ways to knead bread doughs, and finally, how to use all of these techniques to bake a simple and delicious bread at home. First, let's talk about yeast. Baker's yeast is what gives a loaf of bread its lightness. As yeast cells consume the carbohydrates in your dough, they'll produce carbon dioxide gas, which manifests itself in the air pockets within the bread's crumb. Yeast cells reproduce in dough to double their numbers every 100 minutes or so. So the longer you let the dough rise, the more yeast you will have in it. Yeast imparts a slightly sweet, slightly eggy flavor to the dough, so a longer rise will result in more yeast flavor. In this video, we will be using the most easily found form, active dry yeast. It is a granular yeast, with each granule containing a small colony of live yeast encapsulated by a lot of dead yeast cells and growth medium. It has an incredibly long shelf life, from a year in the pantry to decades in the freezer. And for this reason, it can be found in almost all supermarkets in either a large jar or a single individual use packet. The downside to this type of yeast is that it typically requires a rehydration process, known as proofing, before it can be used in the dough. To rehydrate or proof active dry yeast for baking, the baker will need the following. First is active dry yeast. Make sure that it's still within the expiration date, as yeast that has died in your pantry won't proof, no matter how perfect everything else is. Next is warm water. Don't forget that the granules you're mixing into your dough contain live organisms that are most active in a certain temperature range. For baker's yeast, this is about 100 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit, or up to 46 degrees Celsius. Much hotter than that, and the yeast will go into heat shock cascades and will produce undesirable flavors, as well as not multiplying enough to really give your bread the lift and air that it needs. Too cold, and the yeast won't be active enough to reproduce and ferment in your bread, resulting in a flat, heavy loaf. Finally, the yeast will need a food to be coaxed into becoming fully active again. This can be as simple as a single tablespoon of sucrose or table sugar, or as complex as a tablespoon of honey or agave nectar. As long as it contains a digestible saccharide, the yeast are going to be happy. Proofing the yeast is actually very simple. You simply mix the yeast, water, and sugar in a small bowl or even a cup and let it sit for about 20 minutes. After this time, if the yeast was viable, it will have proven itself by making the initially clear water a frothy, cloudy mix. While we wait for our yeast to proof, let's go over our other ingredients. First is the flour. The two types primarily used in home baking are bread flour and all-purpose flour. The primary quality that discerns these two flours are their gluten content. Gluten is a structural protein in wheat that gives flour its ability to thicken a sauce or a dough, as well as bread sponginess. All-purpose flour is just that, all-purpose. It has a moderate gluten content, which makes it suitable for cooking tasks from baking a baguette to browning a bechamel sauce. However, the higher gluten content in bread flour allows for a more resilient dough and a chewier texture, as well as a naturally sweeter flavor. Either flour can be used in this recipe, but bread flour will likely result in more beautiful loaves that can be prepared more easily. The last ingredient necessary for a loaf of bread is salt. The presence of salt within the bread modulates the perception of other flavors. For example, the sodium ions in salt block the bitterness receptors on the tongue. It also decreases the tongue's detection of water, allowing aromatic flavors to be more pronounced. However, salt can create an osmotically harsh environment for yeast, sending it back into dehydration, so it should be added only after the yeast has been proofed and distributed through a cup or two of flour. To mix the dough, pour the proofed yeast mixture into the large bowl. Add 1 cup of your flour and stir until mixed thoroughly. At this point, it's okay to add your salt, but I usually wait until I've added 2 cups of flour. Add flour 1 cup at a time, mixing well between cups. After about 4 to 6 cups, the dough will start pulling away from the edges of the bowl when you're mixing. Once this happens, you can begin kneading the bread. If you have a heavy-duty mixer like this KitchenAid stand mixer, feel free to use it throughout the entire process. Use a paddle mixer attachment for the initial baking, or for the initial mixing, then move up to a dough hook like this one once the dough really starts to thicken, and you can use that throughout the kneading process. Kneading is a process of pushing and folding and working the dough. This work creates a lot of friction between the molecules of the dough. That, combined with the yeast and the salt that we added earlier, will help start to break the disulfide linkages, keeping the gluten molecules coiled up. Once broken, the gluten molecules will unwind and provide more elasticity to the dough. This is referred to as the gluten relaxing. Find a surface that's just around waist high, which is comfortable for pushing down from a standing position. Dust some flour on your work surface to prevent the dough from sticking to it. Work the dough under your hands, pushing your full weight into the countertop. Fold the dough and continue the process. After about 5 minutes, the dough will be less shaggy and start to become really smooth. Once the dough has been thoroughly kneaded and the gluten has started to relax, we can allow the dough to rise. The yeast now has more food from the flour and the bread, and it's going to really start releasing carbon dioxide as it chows down. This is what creates the air bubbles inside of a loaf of bread and makes it lighter. For rising, grease a large bowl. It can even be the mixing bowl that you used earlier if you've cleaned it. And place the dough in the bottoms. Cover the bowl and place it in a quiet place where dust won't get kicked up into the bowl. After about an hour, the dough will have doubled in volume. Now that we've got plenty of air in our dough, we can form it and let it take the shape of our baking pans. Cut the dough into 2 equally sized pieces and fold each piece into the shape desired, whether that be a long, slender baguette, or a round boule, or a block for the pan. If you are using a pan, grease the pan inside with a lecithin-containing lubricant, like cooking spray. The lecithin allows the oil to stick to the sides of the pan while you let the dough rise one final time to take the shape of the pan. Once the bread has risen in its form, score the top with a very sharp knife. This gives the dough a controlled place to expand, preventing it from blowing out. Bake at 450 degrees for 20 minutes. Check on the bread. It should have a golden crust on top. If not, decrease the oven to 300 and bake for another 5 minutes or so. Once ready, remove the bread from the oven and its pan using pot holders and a very thick towel. Place the bread on a cooling rack and allow it to cool for about 20 minutes or so, and enjoy the aroma of fresh baked bread permeating your home.